The late afternoon sun turned the desert range into a shimmering sheet of heat. The Navy SEALs had gathered for their quarterly long-range qualification, an event as much about pride as it was about precision. Brass littered the firing lanes, dull casings glinting under the relentless light, and a faint smell of cordite lingered in the air. The men lay prone on their mats, rifles cradled against their shoulders, eyes pressed tight against scopes, every squeeze of a trigger sending a distant thud echoing off the steel targets a mile away. They were professionals, some of the best marksmen in the world, and this was their element. No one else belonged here. Except her. She was nobody to them, just a woman in dusty jeans, hair tied back, crouching at the far end of the range with a bucket in hand. She bent down every so often, collecting the discarded brass like she had been hired as cleanup help. The SEALs didn't look twice. She didn't have the posture of a soldier, didn't carry herself like someone who had drilled in the unforgiving grind of special operations. She was plain, ordinary, forgettable. Or so it seemed. When the senior officer stepped forward, clapping his hands to gather his men, the mood shifted. "All right, boys, today's stretch test, 4,000 meters. He said it with a grin as if daring them. The distance was absurd. Even the best snipers in the world rarely attempted such a shot outside of theory. At that range, the Earth's rotation had to be considered, the curvature of the planet itself mattered, and the slightest wind could turn a perfect squeeze into wasted brass. Still, the men were eager. "You're joking, right, sir?" One of the younger SEALs chuckled, though he was already adjusting the legs of his rifle's bipod. The officer smirked. "No joke. No one's hitting that. Not today. But I want to see how close you can get. Pride points, gentlemen." They went down the line, one by one, rifles cracking, the recoil hammering their shoulders as they tested themselves against physics itself. A mile out, a speck of painted steel target shimmered, nearly invisible without high-powered glass. Dust plumes kicked up far short, bullets carving harmless scars into the desert floor. No one expected a hit. It was an exercise in humility. And then the woman's voice broke through, soft but steady. "May I try?" The laughter was immediate. A couple of the SEALs glanced up from their scopes, brows raised. One of them barked, "Try what, sweetheart?" Picking up more brass. She didn't flinch. She set her bucket down, stepped forward with a calmness that cut through the smirks. The 4,000-meter target. The officer arched an eyebrow, amused at first, then frowning when he saw she wasn't joking. "Ma'am, this isn't a carnival. These are professional shooters. Even we can't hit that. It's a waste of ammunition." She met his gaze, her tone respectful but unyielding. "One shot. That's all I ask." A murmur rippled through the line. One of the SEALs muttered, "Hell, give her a rifle, let's see her embarrass herself. Could use the entertainment." Another snorted agreement. But there was a tension creeping in, the kind that comes when arrogance meets something it can't quite define. The officer sighed, shaking his head, but finally gestured toward a nearby rifle. A beast of a weapon rested on its bipod, a custom .408 JTAC tuned for extreme distance. Its owner grinned wickedly. She won't even know which end to point down range. But she did. She approached the weapon like it was something familiar, running her hand lightly along the barrel, checking the scope with the ease of muscle memory. She slid prone, nestled the stock into her shoulder, and in one fluid motion began making adjustments, windage, elevation, even compensating for the faint mirage of heat bending above the desert floor. The range fell quiet. The kind of silence that builds before something no one expects. She exhaled slowly, finger brushing the trigger, eyes locked through the glass. The steel target was nothing more than a dot on the horizon, swaying in invisible currents of air. For a long moment it seemed impossible, too far, too absurd. And then the rifle cracked. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, but she didn't flinch, didn't blink. The shot sailed, time stretching as every SEAL tracked the vapor trail through their scopes. A second passed, then two, then three, an eternity in the world of marksmanship. And then it came, a faint, distant clang. The target rang. The silence afterward was heavier than the desert heat. No one breathed, no one moved. A 4,000-meter hit, on the first try. The officer's mouth hung open, words lost somewhere between disbelief and awe. The men who had scoffed stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. She rose smoothly, brushed the dust from her jeans, and picked up her bucket again. "Thank you," she said simply, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. And just like that, she returned to collecting brass. The clang of the steel still seemed to echo in their ears long after it had stopped ringing. Men who had faced firefights in distant deserts and jungles suddenly found themselves speechless, staring at an ordinary woman who had just done the impossible. Some of them shifted uncomfortably on their mats, rifles idle, as if the ground had tilted under them and they were trying to regain balance. The officer, who moments earlier had dismissed her request with a smirk, now stood rooted, jaw tight, eyes following her every step as she bent back down to retrieve another handful of discarded casings. It wasn't supposed to be possible. At 4,000 meters, a bullet's flight was a delicate ballet with physics, humidity, wind, spin drift, even the slight rotation of the Earth itself had to be accounted for. These were factors even seasoned snipers respected, often feared. And yet, she had made it look effortless, like skipping a stone across a pond. One of the SEALs, a lean sharpshooter named Dawson, broke the silence with a low whistle. "No way. That was a fluke." Another, heavier and older, shook his head. "You don't fluke 4,000 meters. You either know what you're doing or you don't even come close." His eyes lingered on her like she was some riddle he couldn't quite solve. The officer finally spoke, his voice clipped. "Again." The woman paused mid-step, straightened and turned back toward him. "You said one shot." "Now I'm saying again," he replied, more command than request. There was an edge in his tone, the kind that comes from a man trying to reassert authority he just lost. She studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then with a slow nod, she set down her bucket once more. The same rifle lay waiting. Its owner, who had expected to watch her fumble, now handed it over in silence, eyes flicking to the officer for direction. She dropped prone again, body aligning with the weapon in one seamless motion. If the first shot had seemed like luck, the ritual she performed now made it clear it wasn't. She adjusted the scope with tiny movements, licked a finger and lifted it slightly to test the wind, then shifted her body just a hair to settle into perfect alignment. "Spotter," she said quietly. The men exchanged glances. "Spotter?" That was sniper talk, precise and professional. Finally, Dawson, still skeptical but curious, crouched down beside her with his scope. "Fine. I'll call it." His voice carried a trace of mockery, though it was thinner now, strained by doubt. She breathed, slow and controlled. "Target." "Same 4,000. Dawson peered through his glass, then gave the call. "Ready." The rifle cracked again, thunder rolling across the range. They tracked it, holding their breath as the seconds stretched. Another faint clang reached them from the horizon. 2 shots. 2 hits. A murmur spread through the line of SEALs, disbelief giving way to something else, respect tinged with unease. They were men trained to dominate any range, to push limits ordinary soldiers couldn't fathom. Yet here was someone outside their brotherhood, someone who didn't wear their uniform, outperforming them at their own game. Dawson lowered his scope slowly, no mockery left in his face. "That wasn't luck," he muttered. The officer's expression hardened, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of something deeper, concern, maybe even fear. "Who are you?" he asked. She stood, brushing dust from her jeans, calm as ever. "No one important." The simplicity of the answer made it heavier, as though she had said more by refusing to say anything at all. She picked up her bucket again and resumed her quiet work, moving down the line and gathering casings with steady patience, ignoring the stares that followed her. For the SEALs, training was suddenly different. Every shot they fired afterward was haunted by the knowledge of what they had just witnessed. Misses stung more sharply, near hits felt hollow, and even the best among them couldn't shake the image of a woman hitting steel at a range that mocked their own limits. Whispers spread quickly among the men. Some speculated she was ex-military, maybe a sniper from a shadowy program no one talked about. Others thought she was a civilian prodigy, a natural talent born with the kind of eyesight and steady hands you couldn't teach. A few entertained the wild idea that she was something more, a ghost from stories passed between operators in dim barracks, the kind of myth no one believed until it stood in front of you and rang steel at 4,000 meters. As the sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the desert, the officer finally called training to an end. The men began policing their brass, though their eyes kept drifting back to the lone figure already working that task quietly, methodically. When the last of the gear was packed, the officer approached her. His voice was low now, stripped of arrogance. "You don't belong here. This is a secure range." She met his gaze evenly, her bucket half full of brass. "I was asked to help. I did." "That shot," he began, then stopped, struggling to find the right words. He had seen enough in his career to know what was and wasn't possible, and this bent the line. "Where did you learn to do that?" Her lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Sometimes when no one is looking, you teach yourself." And with that, she lifted the bucket and started walking, her silhouette stretching across the range as the sun bled into the horizon. The officer watched her go, every instinct telling him this was no coincidence, no simple woman with a lucky hand. Something deeper was hidden in her calm, something that would not let him sleep easy that night. Night had fallen over the desert range, a chill replacing the searing heat of the day. The SEALs sat around a small fire near the barracks, rifles cleaned and stowed, their voices low but restless. The woman's shots were all they could talk about. No mission stories, no usual banter, just the clang of steel at 4,000 meters replaying again and again in their minds. Dawson poked at the fire with a stick, his eyes narrowed. "You guys realize what we saw, right? That wasn't just good shooting. That was surgical." Another SEAL shook his head, his brow furrowed. "I've seen Tier 1 snipers spend weeks calculating for a shot like that. Perfect conditions, days of prep. And she just, what? Walks up cold and nails it twice? It doesn't make sense." "That's the point," Dawson said grimly. "It's not supposed to make sense." The officer, seated apart from them with a metal cup in his hand, hadn't spoken since the range shut down. His silence pressed over the group like a weight. He wasn't just quiet, he was unsettled, though he wouldn't admit it. Leaders didn't show doubt. But inside, his mind kept circling back to her calm voice, her steady hands, the way she'd said spotter like it was second nature. Finally, one of the younger SEALs broke the tension. "So who is she? Civilian contractor? Spook. Some kind of test." His tone was half joking, but the unease in his eyes betrayed him. The officer looked into the fire, the flames flickering in his gaze. "Whoever she is," he said slowly, "she doesn't want us to know. That's the kind of secret that carries a reason." The group fell quiet. They all knew the truth in that statement. In their world, silence spoke louder than anything. Out on the far edge of camp, the woman sat alone on a crate, bucket of brass at her feet. The fire's glow didn't reach her, but the moonlight cast her in silver. She held a casing between her fingers, rolling it absently as though lost in thought. Every movement about her was unhurried, deliberate, like someone who had long ago mastered patience. She could feel their eyes on her even from a distance. Men trained to stalk, to disappear, to read the unseen were failing to hide their curiosity. She didn't mind. Let them wonder. Mystery was a shield, and tonight it wrapped around her tighter than any armor. Hours later, as the fire burned low and the men drifted toward their bunks, the officer remained awake. Restless, he walked the perimeter of the camp, his boots crunching softly on gravel. And then he saw her, still there, still awake, still turning a brass casing in her hand. He stopped a few paces away. "You planning on sitting out here all night?" She looked up, meeting his gaze in the pale light. "Maybe. Most people would celebrate a shot like that," he said, his tone measured. "Or at least brag about it. You hit a record nobody here could touch and you act like it's nothing." Her expression was unreadable. "Records are just numbers. Numbers don't matter to the man on the other end of the barrel." The officer studied her carefully. He'd heard men speak like that before, men who had lived through the burden of knowing exactly what their shots meant. It wasn't the talk of hobbyists or casual hunters. It was the weight of combat, of kills logged and counted, of lives ended at impossible ranges. "You've been there," he said finally, more a statement than a question. She set the casing down in the bucket and stood, brushing dust from her jeans. "I've been many places." He wanted to push, to demand answers, but something in her tone stopped him. She wasn't refusing out of arrogance, she was protecting something, maybe herself, maybe them. He realized then that her silence carried more truth than any explanation could. "You'll forgive my men," he said after a pause. "They didn't mean disrespect." Her eyes softened just slightly. "They're soldiers. Doubt is part of their job. So is pride. I don't take it personally." She turned to leave, lifting the bucket of brass with ease, and walked into the shadows without another word. The officer watched her vanish into the barracks, a quiet unease settling deeper into his chest. He had led men into firefights, extracted hostages under fire, stood in the face of chaos without blinking. But something about her unnerved him. Not fear, something heavier. The feeling you get when you realize the world is bigger than you thought, and some corners of it hold things you'll never fully understand. That night, long after the camp fell silent, the clang of steel still echoed in his ears. The next morning broke with a sharp desert wind, the kind that cut through fabric and carried sand in stinging sheets. The SEALs were up early, their discipline automatic, rifles slung as they moved toward the range again. Today's drills were supposed to be straightforward, mid-range shooting under timed conditions, the bread and butter of accuracy. But none of them could shake the shadow of the previous day. The clang of steel at 4,000 meters weighed heavier than the rifles on their shoulders. She was there again. Bucket in hand, quiet, invisible to anyone who didn't know better. But now the men noticed every movement. The way she scanned the horizon when the wind shifted. The way her hand brushed against each casing, fingertips lingering just long enough to sense something beyond its weight. She was no longer background. She was the question none of them could answer. Dawson couldn't help himself. As he passed her, he muttered low enough for his buddies to hear but not so low she couldn't. "Let's see the miracle worker handle a moving target." He smirked, but the edge in his voice wasn't mockery anymore. It was challenge. She didn't react at first, only continued picking up brass. Then she straightened, her eyes steady. "Set it up." That stopped him. "Wait, you serious?" The officer standing nearby caught the exchange. His jaw tightened. He should have shut it down, reminded them this was no circus, but something inside him wanted to know too. He gave Dawson a nod. "Do it." Minutes later, a steel silhouette target was mounted on a track, rigged to roll sideways across the far end of the range. The system was designed to simulate human movement at distance. Unpredictable, fast, punishing for even skilled marksmen. At 200 meters, it humbled rookies. At 400, it tested veterans. At 1,000, only specialists dared. But she stepped forward and asked the same question as before, voice calm. "Distance?" 2,000, the officer replied almost defiantly. She shook her head once. 4. The SEALs exchanged glances. Some laughed, some cursed under their breath. Dawson swore outright. "That's insane. You can't hit a moving target at 4,000. That's not even..." He stopped because he remembered the clang from yesterday. The track was adjusted, the target set, distant against the horizon where it looked like nothing more than a speck sliding across the desert floor. The wind gusted, sand lifting in veils. Conditions were brutal. Perfect for proving the impossible. She lay prone once more, cradling the Chaytak like it belonged to her. This time she didn't ask for a spotter. She adjusted in silence, the world narrowing down to the whisper of the wind, the subtle sway of heat, the rhythm of her own heartbeat. Her breathing slowed. The chaos of the desert became calculation. The rifle thundered. Through their scopes, the SEALs followed the shot. Time stretched again, long and merciless. Then, clang. The moving target staggered against the impact, a visible jolt even from 4,000 meters away. The sound carried faint but undeniable. Every man on the line froze. Dawson swore again, but this time it wasn't anger, it was awe. Another muttered, "That's not human." She didn't celebrate. She didn't even smile. She simply adjusted her scope again and fired a second shot. Clang. The target jolted once more. 2 hits. On a moving target. At 4,000 meters. The range was dead silent except for the keening desert wind. Men who prided themselves on pushing the edge of the possible suddenly felt like they were standing on the shore of something vast and unknowable. She rose calmly, brushed the dust from her clothes and stepped back. Satisfied. The officer stared at her, throat dry. He had no words. None of them did. That night there was no fire, no banter. The men ate in silence, each caught in his own thoughts. For the first time in years they felt like students again, humbled before a teacher who didn't even ask to be one. The officer, lying awake in his bunk, replayed every detail. The precision. The patience. The refusal to boast. Whoever she was, her skills weren't just rare. They were beyond doctrine, beyond training manuals. This was mastery that defied explanation. And he knew one thing. Sooner or later someone higher up would hear about this. And when they did, the quiet woman picking up brass wouldn't stay anonymous for long. Word traveled faster than bullets. By the next morning, the range wasn't just a training ground anymore. It was a stage. The impossible shots had turned into whispers, and the whispers had turned into something heavier, the kind of rumor that pulled men from nearby units just to see if it was true. Operators, instructors, even a few officers drifted in under the pretense of observing. Nobody said her name, nobody even knew it. She was just the woman with the shot. She arrived the same way as before, jeans dusty, hair tied back, bucket in hand. No weapons slung, no patches on her chest, no swagger in her step. She bent to gather brass as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But this time eyes followed her openly, every man there unable to look away. Dawson muttered under his breath, "She's gonna be a legend before sundown." The officer ignored him, though he felt the truth of it. Legends weren't supposed to be made in quiet desert ranges. Legends belonged to battlefields, to history books. Yet here she was, rewriting what was possible while acting like none of it mattered. "Ma'am," one of the instructors called, breaking the tension. "We've set up a range at 3,500. Wind's rough. Wanna try?" She didn't look up, still stooped over a cluster of casings. "If you want to waste a target, that's your choice." The instructor smirked, but it wasn't derisive. It was almost respectful. He gestured toward the weapon waiting for her, a different rifle this time, its scope already dialed in by men who wanted to see where her limit lay. She straightened, wiped her hands on her jeans, and walked toward it with the same calm steps as before. No hesitation, no thrill, just inevitability. She lay prone, adjusted the scope with minimal movement, then stilled. The desert seemed to quiet with her. The rifle cracked. Seconds later, the clang came again, faint but undeniable. The crowd exhaled as one, as though they'd all been holding their breath. But she wasn't done. Another shot, another hit. The rhythm was uncanny, like she could read the air itself. And then she stood, brushing dust from her knees. Enough. The word was final, not weary but certain. She picked up her bucket and returned to her task, leaving behind a row of hardened men staring at one another with the same unspoken question. Who is she? That night, the officer found himself in his quarters, staring at the glow of his laptop. He typed a few queries into a classified database, looking for records of female snipers, contractors, special programs. The system churned, then spat out lines of redacted reports, fragments of names, operations marked beyond clearance. Nothing concrete. Nothing useful. But one phrase appeared more than once, buried in places it shouldn't have been, the whisper shot. He sat back, rubbing his temples. If this woman was connected to that phrase, then she wasn't just skilled, she was operating on a level the military didn't advertise, a level hidden behind layers of deniability. A knock at his door pulled him back. Dawson stepped in, hesitant for the first time since the officer had known him. "Sir, what if she's not one of us?" The officer frowned. "What do you mean?" Dawson's jaw worked. "I mean, what if she's not military at all? What if she's something else? You've seen it? Nobody just walks up and does that." "Nobody." The officer didn't answer. Because deep down the same thought had crossed his mind. Outside, the desert wind howled, rattling the loose tin on the barracks roofs. Inside, silence stretched heavy. Finally the officer spoke. "Whether she is or isn't, doesn't change the fact she did it. Twice. 3 times. However many. What matters is why." Dawson shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, if word gets out beyond this camp." "It already has," the officer cut in. His voice was low, grim. "And that means someone, somewhere is going to come looking. When they do, we need to be ready." For the first time, Dawson looked unsettled. "Ready for what?" The officer closed the laptop with a soft click. "For the truth. Whatever that is." By the third day the range felt different. What had once been a training ground now had the tension of a theater before the curtain rose. Men lined up not only to fire but to watch, to see if the woman with the impossible shot would step forward again. She didn't volunteer. She never did. She simply arrived with her bucket, crouched in the dust, and gathered brass like that was all she had been asked to do. But it was the silence that unsettled the SEALs most. She didn't explain, didn't boast, didn't even smile. She just was, and that absence of noise became its own kind of gravity, pulling every eye toward her, making every missed shot sting sharper. The officer, standing at the edge of the line, felt the unease deepening. Yesterday's searches in the classified databases had yielded nothing concrete, only redactions, whispers, fragments pointing to shadows. The name Whisper shot gnawed at him. He hadn't told the men. He wasn't sure he should. Dawson, restless and unable to let it go, finally snapped. "Enough of this," he muttered as he stalked toward her. She looked up from her crouch, expression unreadable. "You've shown us still targets. You've shown us moving steel. But combat isn't about perfect silhouettes. It's chaos. Real targets move like men. They duck, they weave, they think." His jaw clenched. "So why don't you show us that?" The officer was about to interject, to shut it down, but the woman rose slowly, dust falling from her jeans. Her voice was calm even. "And if I do? Then maybe we'll know you're not just a ghost tricking the wind." The officer let out a breath. This was spiraling, but he couldn't stop it now. The others were already setting up the scenario. A humanoid target rigged to dart unpredictably across the far track, its movements randomized by a programmed pattern. It wasn't perfect, but it was the closest simulation of a living enemy they could conjure. They set the distance. 4,000 meters again. The men exchanged doubtful looks. This was madness. Even some of the instructors muttered under their breath that it couldn't be done. She didn't flinch. She lay prone, her form melting into the earth like she'd done it 1,000 times. Her hands moved with the same quiet precision, adjusting dials, gauging wind, calculating in silence. Not a wasted second, not a wasted motion. The target jerked into motion, zigzagging across the far horizon like a shadow dancing. She exhaled, slow, deliberate, and squeezed. The crack of the rifle rolled across the desert. The vapor trail streaked invisible arcs through heat and wind, and then the distant clang carried back, faint but final. The target had been hit. A silence heavier than gunpowder dropped over the line. Even Dawson's mouth fell open, his words caught in his throat. But she wasn't done. She chambered another round, tracked the erratic movements again, and fired. Clang. Another hit. A third. The impossible was no longer theoretical. It was right in front of them, undeniable. She rose smoothly, dust clinging to her knees, and set the rifle back on its bipod. Combat is chaos, she said quietly. But chaos can still be read, if you've already lived it. And with that, she walked away, bucket in hand, returning to her quiet task as though she hadn't just dismantled everything they thought they knew. The SEALs stood frozen. Men who had raided compounds, stormed ships, and fought through ambushes now felt small, their pride shattered not by defeat in battle but by the calm certainty of one woman who refused to explain herself. That night, the officer sat in his quarters long after lights out. The phrase "if you've already lived it" played in his head. It was confirmation of what he already suspected. She wasn't just talented. She was experienced. She had done this before. But where? Oh. He pulled his laptop again, fingers flying across keys, digging deeper into restricted files. More redactions, more fragments. But then a pattern emerged, references to a program so classified it barely existed. A program involving long-range interdiction specialists operating off the books. Most were men. A few anonymous redactions. And one phrase repeated again, buried in footnotes: 4K confirmed. He sat back, his pulse quickening. 4,000. The sound of a bucket being set down outside made him freeze. He glanced out the small window. She was there, sitting alone again, moonlight silvering her face as she turned a casing between her fingers. She wasn't hiding from him. She wasn't running. She was waiting. And the realization struck him like recoil. The question wasn't who she was. The question was why she was here. The next day began with a strange electricity in the air. The desert was the same, dry wind, endless dust, steel targets lined up like silent spectators, but the men weren't. Their movements were tighter, their eyes sharper. Every glance slid toward her, even when they tried not to look. She didn't acknowledge it. She was bent over her bucket, picking brass as if the weight of a dozen stares meant nothing. But the officer knew better. Nothing meant nothing to someone like her. He had spent the night combing through those redacted reports again, chasing threads through half-erased records. Fragments of operations in forgotten war zones, nameless sharpshooters credited with impossible kills, and that phrase again, the whisper shot. It showed up in whispers of declassified after-action notes, usually in places where enemies had been neutralized at distances no one admitted were possible. Always attributed to no one. Always buried deep enough that most wouldn't even see it. Now, as the SEALs set up for another day of shooting, he approached her. "Walk with me," he said quietly. For a moment she didn't move. Then she straightened, brushed the dust from her palms, and followed him away from the line. They walked toward the far edge of the range, where the wind carried the crack of rifles into empty desert. "You've done this before?" he said flatly, not asking. "Not training. Real. Combat." Her gaze stayed fixed on the horizon. "Everyone has their past. That shot. Those shots aren't past. They're proof. Nobody does what you did without years of experience. Decades, maybe." His tone hardened. "I've read things. Programs that don't officially exist. Reports of kills that shouldn't be possible. I found a name buried in the margins. The whisper shot." At that, her eyes finally flicked to his. Calm, unblinking. For a second he thought she might laugh, dismiss it as fantasy. Instead, she asked quietly, "And if that name was mine?" The officer's throat tightened. There it was. Confirmation, not in words but in the absence of denial. He exhaled slowly. "Why are you here?" Her answer came after a long silence, her voice low. "Because sometimes you can't leave it behind. No matter how far you go, it follows. The casing. The recoil. The echo. You pick it up again and again and it never goes away." He studied her profile against the horizon, the way her face carried no pride, no bitterness, only a kind of weary acceptance. You were part of it, he said. That program. Whatever it was. She didn't answer, but silence was answer enough. Back at the line, the men were restless. Dawson muttered, "Sir's grilling her. Bet she doesn't give him anything." Another replied, "Doesn't matter. You don't need a story when the steel sings like that." Their words carried unease, the kind that comes when soldiers realize there are weapons in the world they've never trained for, people operating at levels they can't touch. The officer and the woman returned just as the men reset for their next drill. Without a word, she bent again to her bucket, slipping seamlessly back into the role she had adopted. But now the officer looked at her differently. She wasn't anonymous anymore, not to him. She was something far more dangerous, someone the world wasn't supposed to know existed. That evening, after the rifles were cleaned and the brass piled, Dawson cornered the officer. "Sir, we deserve answers. Who the hell is she?" The officer's eyes were tired, shadowed. "She's someone who's done more than any of us can imagine. That's all you need to know." "That's not enough," Dawson snapped. "You saw what she can do. She's one of us, fine. If not, then what the hell are we looking at? A threat." The officer's reply was sharp. "Not a threat. A reminder." Dawson frowned. "Of what?" "That there's always someone out there better. Someone who's already walked where we think we're going. Someone who proves we're not at the edge of the map after all." The younger man hesitated, chewing on that. Pride wanted to fight it, to deny it. But deep down he knew the officer was right. Later that night, as the camp quieted, the woman sat alone again, the moonlight gleaming off her bucket of brass. The officer approached once more, standing a few feet away. "You could teach them," he said. Her eyes stayed on the casing she was turning in her hand. "And what would they learn? That the further you can reach, the less you sleep? That every shot you take at 4,000 meters doesn't end with a cheer but with a silence that follows you for the rest of your life?" He didn't answer. Because he knew she wasn't talking about training anymore. She was talking about the cost. She placed the casing back into the bucket with the rest, the faintest clink breaking the stillness. Then she looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "The question isn't who I am. It's whether you really want to know." And with that, she stood, lifted the bucket, and walked into the darkness, leaving him with the echo of her words and the weight of a truth he wasn't sure he was ready to carry. The fourth morning came quietly. The desert sun rose pale and cold, light spilling across the range like a blade. The SEALs assembled as usual, rifles in hand, but the mood had changed. Pride had given way to respect, respect had deepened into unease, and unease had hardened into something else, reverence. None of them spoke her name, but when she appeared with her bucket, every man straightened unconsciously, as though a commander had entered their presence. She didn't acknowledge them. She bent, picked brass, moved with her steady rhythm. But the silence around her was different now. It wasn't dismissal, it was deference. The officer watched, arms folded across his chest. He hadn't slept. The fragments he had uncovered in classified files swirled in his mind, whispers of a program so secret most would never know it existed. Unofficial records of kills logged at impossible distances. Redactions that screamed more loudly than words. And the phrase repeated again and again, the whisper shot. He couldn't hold it in anymore. He strode forward, stopping just a step away from her. "Tell them," he said quietly. She straightened, brass glinting in her hand. "Tell them what?" "The truth. Who you are. What you've done." His voice was firm, but beneath it was something else, pleading. He wasn't asking out of authority anymore. He was asking out of need. For a long moment she said nothing. The wind kicked up dust, rifles cracked in the distance, but in that space between them, silence stretched. Then she exhaled and set the brass back into the bucket. "I was part of a program that doesn't exist," she said at last. Her voice was low, steady, stripped of theatrics. "We were trained for one purpose: reach farther than anyone else, hit harder than physics allowed. Ghost work. Shots made across valleys, through storms, across borders where no soldier should have been. The kind of shots history books don't print." The men nearby had gone still, their ears tuned, their rifles forgotten. "We were the last resort," she continued. "If a warlord thought he was safe beyond range, if a convoy believed distance was cover, we reminded them it wasn't. We lived in silence. We left in silence. No medals, no names. Just echoes carried by the wind." Her eyes lifted, meeting the officers. For the first time, something raw flickered there, something fragile. "I was good at it. Too good. And the better you are, the longer you stay. Until one day you look at the casing in your hand and realize you've built a life out of brass. That's all." Just brass. The SEALs listened, not breathing, not blinking. The weight of her words pressed into them harder than recoil. So I left, she finished. Walked away. No discharge papers, no retirement, just gone. I thought if I kept my head down, if I did something simple, quiet, maybe the echoes would fade. She looked at the bucket at her feet. But they never do. The officer's throat tightened. He had suspected, but hearing it aloud was different. It wasn't a legend anymore. It was truth, heavy and human. Dawson spoke up, his voice hoarse. Why show us then? Why take the shots? Her gaze shifted to him, calm but sharp. Because you challenged me. Because pride blinds soldiers faster than bullets. You needed to see there's always another edge, always someone who's already been where you think you're going. You needed to know you're not invincible. Dawson lowered his eyes, shame creeping into his face. But it wasn't humiliation, it was humility, the kind that reshapes a man. The officer finally spoke, his tone softer than it had been in days. So what now? She bent, lifted the bucket and looked at him one last time. Now nothing. You'll go on with your training. You'll keep pushing your limits. And I'll keep picking up brass. That's all I want anymore. She turned and walked away, her silhouette framed against the desert light, the bucket swinging gently at her side. The men watched in silence, not one of them daring to speak. For the first time in their lives, they understood what true mastery looked like, not the roar of pride, but the quiet weight of someone who had already lived through the impossible and chosen silence over glory. When she disappeared beyond the line, Dawson let out a shaky breath. Sir, what do we even call her? The officer's eyes lingered on the horizon. He thought of the files, the whispers, the redacted names. Then he shook his head. You don't. You just remember. The clang of steel still echoed in their ears, but now it carried something deeper than awe. It carried the reminder she had left them with, that distance, pride, and even certainty itself were fragile things. And somewhere out there, beyond every map, there would always be a whisper waiting in the wind. The end.